Like so many modern immigrants, Brian Connolly came to America for the money, not any idealistic notion of freedom. Brian believed simply and fully that money was freedom. "Money's green too," Mick Ryan had said to him one night in a London pub. "No harm in an Irishman getting his fair share of it." Ireland was an economic bog. America, the land of opportunity, offered salary incentives and health benefits, credit, low interest rates, and attractive loan arrangements, as well as religious toleration and freedom of speech. Splitting his loyalties into heart and purse, Brian remained a citizen of Ireland while he pursued the American dream. He was educated in London, then secured a job in the States with a national clothing manufacturer, working as a fashion designer in men's formal wear. He began in New York, where all things seem to begin in America, and, after a series of relocations, wound up in the Midwest, in Kentucky, which he considered rustic, quaint, and humorous, full of vivid, rough-and-tumble characters, reminiscent of his rural country, which he missed very much. Even the land made him homesick, and looking out over the rolling countryside, which the natives called bluegrass, he could recall his father telling him that an Irishman was able to tell the difference from 1,000 shades of green. He lived in an A-frame house near a small lake, drank Kentucky bourbon, played poker late into the night, and even went on a hunting expedition. He missed the deer, shot a truck, and his American friends laughed their heads off, clapped him on the back, and called him a good sport, one for the ages. Life for Brian became a cycle of work and celebration. He had the world, he felt, by its hoary old bare backside. He was earning on the sunny side of 6 figures, up for a promotion, treated to homemade pot at parties, cocaine in New York at the regional meetings, and women in Tokyo, which he visited as a member of the team in charge of overseas expansion of production. "How's the business world?" people would ask him, and Brian would say, "The business world is great." Then, in rapid succession, his company was bought by another company, which was bought by yet another company, which decided to sell off the men's formal wear division to raise the cash needed to pay off the huge debt incurred by the purchase price, and so, suddenly, brutally, after 16 years, 2 months short of satisfying his pension requirement, Brian Connolly was out of work, living on unemployment checks. 39 years old, owner of a house, a mortgage, and a fully equipped BMW 320i, which was his on a leasing arrangement. He was married for the second time and the father of a newborn baby girl. Dear God, he thought, the terror twisting his throat and clutching at his bowels. Here's all that schooling in London and working in America for a great big company, and now I've got no more to show for it than the poor sods back in Dublin. He felt betrayed, terribly cheated, angry and bitter. This was not the outcome of the bright American dream as he had clearly foreseen it, along with his mates back in the London days. And the unfairness of it all, the awful shitty treatment, let go 2 months short of pension, and his boss, who still had a job, had said, "I know it's hard now, Brian, but someday you'll look back and thank me." The bastard, the nerve of the bastard, so typically American. Americans care about only 2 things, money and their own sweet asses, that's what Brian thought. A good American would run his mother down to pick up $1 in the road. For 9 months he vigorously pursued another job in the clothing industry, the rag trade, as his father used to call it. He sent out broadcast letters and faultless resumes printed on the finest cream-colored bond paper. He retained a headhunter at crippling expense and secured 5 interviews in New York, 1 in Kentucky, 2 in Tennessee, and 1 in San Francisco, and was generally praised to the skies for his experience, his portfolio, his charm, and his abilities, but he received no offers and found no job. In the meantime, while waiting for the phone to ring, he had been painting and thinking seriously of trying it as a career. He'd toyed with the idea before, when he'd had one eye on an early retirement. 2 bloody months! But now his life had changed radically. Painting might be a salvation, not just a fine way to pass the time. He was an able enough draftsman. He could mechanically reproduce a picture from a photograph in oils or wash with satisfying fidelity, even adding a touch of his own here and there. Painting might provide him with the income he desperately needed, as his funds were growing perilously short, and it also appealed to his bruised and damaged ego, this notion of being an artist. He had paintings on the walls of his house, a private gallery of work he'd made from photographs he had of the old country. Sentimental scenes, landscapes, a turf cart, a butcher shop, as well as pictures of his wife, romantic studies, along with a few paintings his father had done, including one he'd finished only months before his death. Brian had signed his father's name to the picture. At the time, it had left him with a sadness. Now it gave him a sense of legacy and determination, as if painting might be in his blood. His wife was plainly horrified at the prospect, wondering how they would pay the mounting bills. He had mentioned this as a possibility, the career switch, before they were married, but then it had only been a romantic notion to her, another reason to love him, that artistic sensibility. Now that it was actually being considered, it scared the hell out of her. She suggested that he find work as a clothing salesman, something at least in his field. He did not tell her that he had already tried. He hotly replied that he designed clothes, he did not sell them. She told him that if he did not sell something soon, they would have no clothes to wear. He would have to design something out of shopping bags. It was true. His employment money, insufficient as it was running out. They had one check to go, and so she reluctantly, resentfully returned to her job as the receptionist at a high school. He told her they were lucky the job was still open, and she stared at him, speechless. After that, he said no more. Under the strain, she was beginning to show flashes of temper, bursts of sarcasm like the crack about the shopping bags. He viewed them as warning flares, and, understanding her anxiety, he let them pass. He stayed at home with their baby daughter, named for his mother, and while she napped in the quiet of the day, he painted. Of course a man had the duty to support his family, and Brian tried to develop a market for his work. He ran an attractive ad, he designed it himself, in a little tabloid newspaper that served several upper-class neighborhoods, billing himself as an artist in oils and watercolors who would paint homes and summer cottages as well as portraits from life and heirloom photos. The ad, he thought, was tasteful, a minor work of art in itself. It represented him well, and it had better, as it had cost him money he could no longer afford. He received one immediate response from the ad from an elderly gentleman who misread it and thought he was a house painter. After that came the businessman who gave him a photograph of himself and his wife, so he said, standing nude on a seashore. It was a ludicrous photo. There they were, posing stiffly, as if for a wedding picture, in their birthday suits on some beach. He wanted an oil reproduction, only bigger, much bigger, he said. Brian said, "You mean the whole picture, right?" And the man, never suspecting the joke, said yes, and indicated the size he wanted by holding his hands far apart, looking for all the world like the proverbial fisherman, relating a story about the one that had gotten away. Brian nodded his head. He knew all about the one that had gotten away. Brian was disgusted. This was not what he'd had in mind, but the man offered too much money for him to turn the work down. "Add a sunset, will you, the man had said, "with the light dancing on the waves, you know." Brian had to laugh after the man had left, at the awful, utter, innocent vulgarity of these Americans. So crass they were, with their huge wads of money, their love of size, and their complete lack of taste. They put the word Philistine right out of use. His picture summed it up, he thought, an ironic epiphany, two unattractive naked creatures holding hands on a beach, enjoying a phony sunset. American Gothic, he told his wife, but she didn't get the joke. She was not in a laughing mood. Brian also visited realtors who worked in the pricier areas, showed them samples of his work, a rendition of a beautiful Victorian home that happened to be for sale, and he advised them of what an excellent housewarming present this might make, instead of a basket of fruit or a door knocker, for someone who had just dropped $1 million or more into a home. The realtors were uniformly impressed. "It's a great idea," they all said. "We'll get back to you." A few requests for work came in from his network of friends and business acquaintances, and he was convinced that if he could place a few paintings among the right people, the trickle would become a stream. He would become collectible and chic, with a wealthy and loyal clientele. He even projected travels to exotic locations, the Caribbean, Spain, the Mediterranean, to paint resort homes and be spoiled by the rich as an artist. The rich, he knew, did that to comfort their vanity. They kept artists around like pets. And in return, the artist painted pictures of them and their homes and their children, horses and dogs, all in the best light, emphasizing their dear and tender qualities, which complemented, in an intimate way, their vast holdings. Flattery, flattery, that was the way to their hearts and funds. Extreme unction, Brian thought, lay on the ooze. Court artists had discovered this long ago in Italy, France, and England, the Orient, too. Now he, Brian Connolly, transplanted Irishman, could become the darling of the American aristocracy. His wife remained fearful and skeptical, but as supportive as she could be. So Brian had a plan for success, with one minor hitch. He did not feel like a true artist. He missed the sustaining confidence of knowing for sure that he was a true artist. He thought his work might lack depth, or originality, vision, something. The insecurity troubled him, but he counseled himself that he had talent, and artists could be developed gradually, as well as born. An artist really was his reputation, his name. It was the same in the clothing industry. Once in New York, Brian had met one of the famous men who had designed the line of clothes sold by Brian's company. In actuality, Brian designed the clothes. "Well, Brian," the man had said cordially, though they had never met before, "what have you been doing for my name?" Yes, the name was everything. Picasso, Miro, Gauguin, Degas, but it took time to become somebody. Yet the life of an artist looked inspiring, attractive. He read a book on Picasso, that remarkable man, the very figure of an artist. As far as Brian could determine, all Picasso did, in his maturity, was paint and screw, choices he felt he could live with, though he would have to make allowances for his domestic situation. And Brian met a friend one night, a musician, and while sharing a joint, he asked him what it was like being an artist, thinking that not everybody could have it quite as good as that rogue Picasso. The musician laughed. "The role of the artist, man," he said, "is to suffer and die." Well, this man was single, had no family, lived out of a suitcase. And he was stoned. Musicians were notoriously unstable. His role model was no doubt someone more like Van Gogh. Brian had no desire to either suffer or die until it was absolutely necessary. Yet Picasso, with all that Spanish blood, was too unrestrained. Brian had a vision of the artist as an elevated, successful person, a man of style and taste. Where he came from, artists were respected men, admired, lionized. Artists were heroes. He could see himself in that role, and he knew he looked the part with his Irish heritage, the reddish beard neatly trimmed, his blue eyes and handsome visage, and he was a gregarious sort, full of enough blarney to charm anyone with ease. Still, deep inside, he did not feel like an artist. Yeats and Joyce, they were artists. He was something short of that. He went to a class to learn techniques, tricks of the trade, so to speak, from a master painter he had heard others highly recommend, Edward Gross. Over the phone, he determined that the first class, for inspection purposes, would be free of charge. He arranged a sitter for the baby, traveled 60 miles to attend, and the class was bitterly disappointing to him. The other students were all senior citizens, old ladies and a few old men. They talked more than they painted, complaining about their ailments and their children and grandchildren. Edward Gross was a disappointment too. Brian was fastidious, and Edward Gross had paint in his beard. His breath smelled like cabbages. The man was a slob. Brian decided that as long as he had come such a long way, he would stay for this one class, and then come no more. He knew that artists had to endure loneliness and doubt. It had been silly to think that a class would help him. Courage and faith were more likely allies. He was working on a scene that depicted three men in a pub. Edward Gross came up and looked at it. He was an old German. Brian had seen his work and admired it. Despite the pain in his beard, Gross might be able to show him a secret or two. Gross stared at his painting, staring with dark, deep-set eyes. his lips compressed, obviously disapproving. Brian lost all freedom with his brush, felt intimidated by the old man looming at his shoulder, fanning him with his vile cabbage breath. "What's on your palette?" Gross said at last. "I'm using a lot of browns," Brian said. It was a deep picture, this scene inside a dark Irish pub, a theme close to his heart, pulled directly from his knowledge and experience. It was more than three men in a pub. It was an archetype of Ireland itself, like three humans crowded around a campfire might represent the entire race. The old people in the room, the few who were actually painting, were working on bogus landscapes, snow-topped mountains, phony ocean sunsets, cactus in the desert, that kind of hopeless schlock. Brian liked interiors. Interiors get to the heart of things, that's what he thought. Interiors tell a story. Everything is intimate. Every detail is rich and eloquent. The painting itself has meaning. Rooms are haunted by everything that has ever happened inside them. His pub scene told a story that he had personally witnessed hundreds of times. It was the story of Ireland. Yes, there were many stories of Ireland, but this was the story of her soul. Anyone who knew her would know the instant they saw his painting. They would recognize these men. You could see their lives in their faces, the eyes, the expressions. They were consoling themselves with Guinness and stout for the romance they had never found, for the youth they had lost, for their country which was still not free. All hopes unfulfilled, yet they covered their bitterness and sorrow with a gaiety, a hearty cheer that was their only protection against the chill winds of fate. And all this was coming to life on the canvas. The picture was developing slowly. He had been working on it for months, since before he'd been fired, but he was pulling it along, not rushing it, trying to nurse it into life. So much of it was nuance and subtlety. In a way, he was trying to paint the ineffable, the very lives of these men, the heart of a nation, quite a challenge, just the kind of task real artists tackled. "I can see that," Gross said, "but what is all this?" He waved his hand at the painting, indicating the colors. "Raw umber, burnt sienna, Van Dyke brown," Brian said, pointing the end of his brush at each color in turn, and carefully omitting mention of the lamp black. He had read that no good painter ever used black. He didn't know whether that was true, or one of those rules that really great painters, the artists, broke all the time. He had been scrupulous starting out to equip himself with the finest and most discriminating shades of color so that he could evoke the slightest hints of emotion and light. Gross frowned and reached into Brian's paint supply, a reconverted toolbox which had formerly housed fishing tackle. He grabbed a fistful of paint tubes and held them up, inspected them, then interrupted the room of painting and crabbing old people by shouting out the names in a loud and angry voice. "Payne's gray, sap green, Hooker's green, green earth, Naples yellow, Prussian blue, Venetian red." Everyone in the room was staring at them. Brian blushed a deeper shade of red than his russet beard. Gross, his eyes glittering now in anger, was holding up a single tube, isolating it from the batch and shaking it as if it was particularly offensive. "Transparent gold ochre," he cried, and then he tossed all the tubes back into Brian's box disdainfully. "You don't need all this," he said. "All you need on your palette is red, yellow, and blue." His furious hands, stained with paint, years of paint worn into his knuckles and dried under his nails, selected two tubes, cadmium yellow and ultramarine blue. "Where is your red?" he said. In his anger, his voice reverted to a heavy German accent. "Where is your red?" hissing like a snake. Brian picked through his box and said, "I have Indian red, alizarin crimson, cadmium, barium light red. I need cadmium, barium, deep red. That is all," Gross said. "Red, that's all. Red, yellow, blue." Frantically, Brian pawed through his box. He had a tube of it somewhere. Christ, he had a tube of everything. "I can't find it," he told the crazy old man. "Would cobalt violet do?" "Here," Gross said, and he grabbed a tube from someone else's box. He spun the cap off and squeezed a blob out on Brian's palette, making three: red, yellow, blue. Gross chanted the colors like it was a mantra. Red, yellow, blue. Red, yellow, blue. Brian thought he sounded like a color Nazi, saluting his doctrinal rainbow. Red, yellow, blue. Then Gross began to dip his brush in the colors and mix them in a separate spot. There, he kept saying as he dipped, dabbed, and swirled. There, as if soothing and coaxing a baby. He worked for a full 5 minutes at this, silently, furiously, and yet somehow also tenderly, occasionally muttering, creating 4 distinct shades of brown. Now, he said when he was done, this is color. It is light. You can work with it. Look at it. Light, living color, that, and he nodded with contempt at Brian's canvas. That is mud. Gross put down the palette and brush and walked away. Not one word did he say about the composition or the subject matter. Yeah, great, but that mud cost me $50, Brian muttered, seeking to contain a fury of his own. What was with this Gross? Was he crazy or jealous? He hadn't yelled at any of the old geezers like that. Christ, they'd die on the spot if he did. Brian thought the crude old man was probably right, but it still seemed like a waste of time to mix a shade when you could buy it. Well, what the hell? He tried using Gross's colors and ruined the painting. He kept at it until it was beyond redemption, when even the likenesses of the men were lost. Now the painting really did look like mud, the bottoms of a murky lock, not the inside of a pub. Nothing could salvage it. Brian, furious, grit his teeth, put his things away. His first attempt at a masterpiece, at painting something worthy of the effort, a shadow of Ireland, was ruined. He left the class angry and thoroughly depressed. Driving home, he could hear old Cabbage Breath shouting, hissing, bullying him, and now, too late, he wished he'd stood up to him, defending his colors, demanding some analysis of his canvas before he'd gone and wrecked it. What did Gross know? Technique? How to save a few bucks by mixing his own colors? Big deal. He had no soul, knew nothing of the deep, eternal, recurring themes that made men what they are. That was what Brian was after. Gross was no artist. Of this he knew nothing, absorbed in his petty concerns. He didn't even know hygiene.